The brass nameplate on the door of the private dining room on the 41st floor of the Signal Soul read in two scripts, Beckrock, White Deer. It had been engraved in 1997 by a man in Insadong, who took commissions only from families older than his grandfather's debts, and it had been carried up to this floor in a velvet cloth the night the hotel opened, and it had not been moved since. Behind that door, on the long ebony table that had been the centerpiece of a Cheongdam estate before it was the centerpiece of a banquet, sat a small lacquered box no larger than a paperback, black with a single chrysanthemum in mother-of-pearl locked. Inside the box was a folded sheet of hospital paper from Asan Medical Center, dated the 17th of March, 11 years ago, and a child's hospital bracelet with a name printed in Hangul on one side and in Latin letters on the other. The box had been placed on the table at 6:14 p.m. by a woman in a navy coat who had given the maitre d' a name that was not hers and who had paid in cash for nothing because she had ordered nothing. She had left the box and walked out, and the maitre d', who had served in this room for 19 years and had learned the discipline of forgetting, had not opened it. 11 floors below, in the lobby bar called Stay, Kang Min Jae was drinking a soju neat that the bartender had poured into a crystal tumbler because Min Jae did not like the small green bottles in front of guests. He was 41 years old. The watch on his wrist was a Lange one that had been a gift from a man now dead. The overcoat folded over the bar stool beside him was a navy cashmere that had cost more than the night manager downstairs earned in a year, and he had not bothered to put it back on after the cold walk from the car. He was waiting for his fiancée to come down from the spa on the 40th floor so that they could ride up together to the 41st and let his mother see her for the first time in the room. That meant the most. Min Jae watched the elevator on the far wall of the lobby for 41 minutes. He drank half the soju and set the glass on the marble and felt the cold wring it left and thought, with the kind of quiet his mother had taught him to mistrust, that his mother had not telephoned him all week. Eomeoni. He had taken this for grace. He should have taken it for warning. He had once dismissed, at a dinner long ago, the saying his Halmeoni from Andong used to whisper into her doenjang pot, that a woman who has stopped speaking has not stopped counting. He had laughed and poured her more macchioli. He had been 28 and full of himself, and the old woman had looked at him without smiling and said nothing because she was already counting. On paper, he was Kang Min Jae, born in Seongbuk-dong in the spring of a year his father refused to celebrate, second son of a shipping family that had been absorbed in the late 90s into something the newspapers were never permitted to name in full. He held the title of vice chairman at Beckrock Holdings, which was the registered face of a brotherhood that owned 31% of a port in Busan, a private bank in Labuan, a chain of clinics in Gangnam, and the silence of 2 prosecutors and 1 judge. He had signed the previous Thursday at 4:12 p.m. in a notary's office in Yeoksamdong, the preliminary articles of a merger that would join Beckrock to the Hwang Group through the daughter of the family's 3rd son, a marriage that would bring with it a controlling stake in a logistics corridor that ran from Vladivostok down to Busan and out to the Caymans through Singapore. The daughter's name was Hwang Seo-yeon. She was 29, had taken her MBA at INSEAD, and wore her hair in the same low chignon her mother had worn in the only photograph the press had ever been permitted to publish. She had told him 3 months earlier on a balcony in Hanam that she did not love him yet, but that she would learn, and that her family taught daughters to learn the way other families taught sons to fight. He had believed her. 3 years before this evening, he had been married to a woman named Adaeze Onyeka, whose name in her mother's village in Anambra meant daughter of the king, and whom his uncles had called in private rooms he was not meant to enter. That woman. He had divorced her on the 14th of June, 3 years prior, in a private settlement that bore the seal of a firm in Gwanghwamun and the signature of an uncle who was not, in fact, his uncle. He had told himself every morning since that he had moved on paper. The first warning had come on a Sunday in October in his mother's kitchen in Pyeongchang-dong, the one with the slate floor she refused to replace, and the gas range she had used to make John since before he was born. He had arrived for lunch with a box of pears from a Cheongdam grocer, wrapped in pale yellow paper, and she had set them on the counter without unwrapping them and ladled doenjang jjigae into a stone bowl for him and one for herself and none for the woman he had brought. Hwang Seo-yeon had sat in the chair by the window, perfectly still, and had eaten her stew when her bowl finally came, after his was half empty, and his mother had not looked at her once. The second warning had come at the gate of the family cemetery in Yangpyeong on Chuseok, when his mother had laid out the jesa table in the old order, with the rice to the east and the soup to the west, and had quietly added a fourth bowl. He had asked, smiling, who the fourth bowl was for, and his mother had not answered him, and the wind had moved through the chestnut trees the way it had moved through them the year his sister was buried under the tallest of them. The third warning had been a glance across the long table at the Shilla 2 weeks before the engagement banquet, when he had introduced Seo-yeon to the family elders over a course of Hanwoo, and his mother had looked not at the bride-to-be, not at him, but at the empty chair at the foot of the table where Adaze had once sat through a dinner of 41 courses in the first year of their marriage, and had eaten everything, including the soup made of intestines that none of the aunts had expected her to touch. The empty chair had been holding his mother's eye for the length of 3 breaths. He had not noticed. He had been laughing at something Seo-yeon had said about the wine. He had been wrong. He did not yet know how wrong. At 6:47 p.m. on the 17th of November, his phone, the personal one, not the burner, vibrated against the marble of the bar with a message from a number that had no name attached. The message was a single line in Hangul that read, 41st floor, Beckrock room, now, alone. He looked at the timestamp and at the number, and he did not need to call the security desk to know that the number traced to a burner phone purchased in cash that morning at a convenience store in Eunpyeong-gu for 14,700 won, the kind sold to old men who do not trust banks and to women who have stopped trusting their husbands. The security cameras in that store ran on a 48-hour loop. The phone had been bought 37 hours and 20 minutes ago. He understood before he stood that whoever had sent the message had counted the loop and had wanted the footage to be gone by the time he thought to ask for it. He finished the soju. He made one phone call to the driver, telling him to send Seo-yeon home in the car if she came down before he returned, and to wait for further instruction. He picked up the navy coat. He rode the elevator from the lobby to the 41st floor in the kind of silence that he had taught himself, after the divorce, to mistake for peace. He stood outside the door of the Beckrock room for a moment and listened to the way the hotel's air handling system breathed through the ceiling. He could hear, from inside the room, no voice. He knocked twice, the way his father had taught him to knock on the doors of older men. The door opened. The woman on the other side was not who he had expected, and she was also not who, in the part of himself he had spent 3 years burying, he had feared. She was tall, taller than he remembered, in a dress the color of wet slate, with her hair pulled back from a face that had lost weight in the way faces lose weight when grief is being managed, rather than mourned. Her skin was the deep brown of the river stones in her mother's village, polished by a kind of light he had once written a clumsy line of poetry about, and then thrown away. In her left hand, she was holding a manila folder, unmarked, of the precise thickness of 70 pages. On the third finger of her right hand was no ring. She was 41 years old. She had been born in Lagos and raised in Houston and educated at Wharton, and then at Yonsei, where she had taken a second degree in forensic accounting under a professor who had once testified at the trial that had brought down the Seo brothers in 1998. She had been, until 3 years ago, his wife. Her name was Adaeze Onyeka, and in the Igbo of her mother's people, her name meant daughter of the king, and her Halmione, the Korean grandmother she had earned, not inherited, had called her Adaya, dropping the E's the way only family was permitted to drop it. She was not smiling. She was not crying. She was looking at him with the steadiness of a person who had finished, some weeks ago, the work of being surprised by him. Behind her, at the long ebony table, the small lacquered black box sat untouched in the center of the wood, and beside it, in the chair at the head of the table, sat his mother. Iomeoni was wearing the gray hanbok she had last worn at his sister's 49th day rite. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were not on him. Adaeze stepped aside from the door. Her voice, when she spoke, was lower than he remembered, and the Korean in it had the soft southern slope of Jeolla that she had learned from his mother and never lost. She said, "Anjuseo, sit down." He sat. "If you are still in the room with me, breathing the way I am breathing, pause here for one moment and tap subscribe to Midnight Love Saga. Tap the bell so the next chapter finds you the way a letter finds the right house. What is about to unfold in the next 40 minutes will rearrange your understanding of loyalty in 3 places and rebuild it with something quieter, harder, and far more human than what you walked in with. Stay. You are going to want to be in this room when the box is opened and when the old woman finally speaks, and you are going to want to be the kind of viewer who does not look away. And when it is over, tell me one thing in the comments. What is the kindness someone did for you that you only understood after they were gone? To understand what happened in the Beckrock room that night, you have to go back 11 years and 4 months to a soul that no longer exists in either of their memories the way it actually was. A soul before the towers in Yowido had reached the height they reach now, before the river had been relit, before his Halmione in Andong had stopped recognizing the faces in the photographs on the wall. Minjae had met Adaeze in the lobby of a bank in Gwanghwamun on a Tuesday in July. The kind of Tuesday when the rain comes down warm and the city smells of wet concrete and fried dough from the vendors near the Kyobo bookshop. She had been 29 in a charcoal pencil skirt and a white blouse, holding an umbrella she had not yet opened, waiting for an appointment with the head of compliance to whom she had been seconded for 6 months from a forensic firm in Singapore. He had been 30, in a black suit, waiting for nothing in particular but in the manner of a man who waited for everything, accompanied by 2 men with earpieces who pretended to read newspapers. She had looked at him once, the way a person looks at a painting they cannot yet decide whether they like, and she had returned to her book. The book was Hong Kong in English, the slim one about the woman who refuses to eat meat. He had asked her in English whether the translation was true to the Korean. She had answered him in Korean that translations were never true to anything, only sometimes kind. He had laughed, and the 2 men with earpieces had stopped pretending to read. They were married 11 months later in a small ceremony at a hanok in Bukchon that his Halmione had hired with her own savings against the wishes of the uncles, because she had said the first time she met Adaeze that the girl had eyes like a person who has already buried someone she loved and was therefore safe to love back. Adaize had buried her father at 14 in Houston, of a heart that had given out on the floor of a petrol station he owned. His Halmione had buried her son, Minjae's father, at 51, of cirrhosis that no one in the family was permitted to name. The two women had recognized each other in the way that the bereaved recognize each other across rooms, and within a month of the wedding, Adaize had begun arriving at the Pyeongchang-dong house at 6 in the morning on the days his mother was alone, to cook the doenjang jjigae the way the old woman liked it, with the anchovy broth simmered for 41 minutes, no shorter. She had learned to make John by standing at his mother's shoulder for an entire chuseok. She had learned the prayers at the Jesa table by listening, not by asking. His Halmione in Andong had given her the family quilt, a baby quilt stitched in the early 60s for a child who had not survived the winter, and had told her, in the dialect Adaize did not yet understand, that the stitches were a kind of letter, and that the letter had been waiting for her. In the second year of the marriage, Adaize gave birth at Severance Hospital in the early hours of the 17th of March to a daughter. They named her Kong Chiamaka in 2 scripts on the hospital bracelet. The Igbo name, meaning God is beautiful, and the Korean name they used at home, Ye-rin, meaning graceful and wise. The child had her mother's eyes and her father's mouth, and she had lived 4 years and 1 month, and she had died in the same hospital on a Thursday in April of a complication from a routine surgery to repair a heart defect that had been diagnosed too late. The cardiologist, a Dr. Han on the 14th floor, had wept in the corridor. The grave was in Yangpyeong, under a small stone with 2 names and 1 date. In the year after Chiamaka, Adaize did not leave the Pyeongchang-dong house. She moved into the spare room next to his mother's and cooked for her every morning, and read to her every evening from a Korean translation of Toni Morrison that she corrected by hand in the margins. She drove her to Asan Medical Center for the first heart procedure and to Severance for the second, and she paid, out of an account she had opened in Singapore in her own name 3 months before her daughter died, for the third procedure when the insurance refused. She did not tell Minjae. She did not tell anyone. When his mother temporarily lost the use of her legs after the second procedure, Adaize carried her to the bathroom 3 times a day and bathed her and washed her hair and trimmed her toenails, and never once said a word about it to a soul, because to say it would have made it something other than what it was. In the 3rd year, the uncles began to talk. They said the marriage had been a mistake. They said the brotherhood needed an alliance, not an alien. They said the child's death had been a sign. Minjae, sitting in rooms he should not have been sitting in, drinking what he should not have been drinking, listening to men he should never have permitted to speak about his wife, allowed the talk to become a possibility, and the possibility to become a plan, and the plan to become a settlement signed on the 14th of June by a hand that had once held his daughters. He told himself that night that he was protecting Adaize from a life she had not asked for. He told himself on the morning of the 15th that she had agreed too easily and that this was proof she had wanted out. He told himself by the end of that summer that he had moved on. She had not protested. She had signed. She had walked out of the Gwanghwamun office at 11:47 in the morning into a rain that had not been forecast, and she had not looked back, because to look back would have given him the wrong information about what was happening inside her. In the Beckrock room on the 41st floor at 7:34 p.m., Adaize unlocked the lacquered box and removed the folder and laid the 70 pages on the table in front of him in the order she had numbered them in her own hand. The pages were the accumulated work of 2 years and 7 months, beginning the week after the divorce had been finalized, when she had received, at her Singapore address, an envelope with no return address containing a single photograph of his mother in a hospital gown, being wheeled down a corridor at Samsung Medical Center, taken without her knowledge. The photograph had been a warning to Adaze that the family had not finished with her. Adaze had understood, looking at it, that the family had not finished with his mother either. The 70 pages, in summary, were these. Huang Xiaoyon's father had, through a vehicle registered in Labuan as Yunhai Maritime S.D. NBHD, been quietly purchasing the debt of Beckrock Holdings through a sequence of 7 transactions between Zurich and the Caymans, dated between the 11th of February and the 23rd of August of the previous year, totaling, in one, 4,300,000,000, one above the consolidated book value of the company. The purchases had been laundered through a shell in Vladivostok that bore the name of a fishing concern that had not, according to port records cross-checked by Adaze, with a former classmate at the Singapore MAS, landed a fish in 9 years. The intended endgame of the marriage, scheduled for the spring, was the transfer of 41% of Beckrock's voting shares from Minjae to a trust controlled by Seo Yeon's mother, in exchange for the cancellation of the debt the Huang family had quietly acquired. Minjae would be retained, on paper, as vice chairman. He would not be retained, in fact, as anything. 3 people had already died to bring the operation this close to its completion. A junior accountant named Park Ji-ho, who had worked at the Labuan branch, had been found in his apartment in Kuala Lumpur on the 2nd of September, the cause given as cardiac arrest, the toxicology never requested by a family that had been compensated quickly and quietly. A maritime auditor named Olu Adebayo, a Nigerian national working in the Singapore office of an international firm, had been struck by a delivery scooter in Tanjong Pagar on the 14th of October. The driver never found. The helmet camera mysteriously empty for the relevant 19 seconds. A retired prosecutor named Yu Sang-chul, who had been quietly preparing a memorandum on the cross-border financing of Korean port concessions, had died on the 11th of November of what his family had been told was a sudden stroke at home, although the cleaning lady had told a neighbor who had told her cousin who worked at the National Forensic Service that there had been a half-finished cup of tea on the desk that had not been his usual tea. Adaze had compiled the deaths in a single annexed page with 1 sentence of cause and 1 sentence of forensic doubt for each, and had numbered the page 41. "They will not need you alive," she had written at the bottom of that page, in her own hand, in Korean, in pen. Salyo dulgo sul sengaki opsumnida. Minjae read the pages twice. He set the folder down on the ebony table beside the lacquered box. He looked at his mother, who had not moved, and at Adaez, who had returned to standing by the window. The rain had started over the city. He asked quietly 3 questions in the order he had taught himself, long ago in a different room, to ask questions when his life was being rearranged. He asked who had verified the Labuan filings. Adaez answered, "A friend in compliance at MAS Singapore." She assigned an affidavit. It is on page 62. He asked what the prosecutor in Seoul knew. Adaez answered, "Enough to indict." Not enough yet to indict the Huang family without the wire records you can pull from the Labuan account tonight. He asked, last, why she had come. Adaez did not answer at once. She walked from the window to the table. She placed one hand, palm down, on the lacquered box, the way a person places a hand on a stone at a grave. She said, "I did not come back for you, Minjae. I came back because your mother is the only mother I will ever have, and I made her a promise on the day she stopped being able to walk that I would not let her be sold by people who would not have washed her hair." That was the 3rd quotable line. His mother, who had not spoken in any of his memories of that evening until that moment, lifted her eyes and said, in the Jeolla dialect she had not used in front of him since his sister died, Adaya, Irulta engusarami ne tarirahe. Tell him, when this is over, that I called you my daughter. Adayez did not look at her. She looked at Min Jae, and she said, in Korean, steadier than his own had been all year, I came back for the part of you that held our daughter on the morning she was born and counted her fingers in 2 languages. I did not come back for the part of you that signed papers in Gwanghwamun in the rain. That part of you is not mine to forgive, and it is not mine to want, and it will not be in any room I sit in for the rest of my life. That was the 4th quotable line. Min Jae did not answer. He had been taught, by men he no longer respected, that to answer in such a moment was to lose. He had been taught, by a woman he had finally begun to respect again, that to answer was not the point. At 9:47 p.m. on the 18th of November, 26 hours after he had left the Beckrock room with the folder under his arm, Min Jae walked into a boardroom on the 38th floor of the Hwang Group building in Yeoksam-dong without an appointment. He was wearing the same navy coat. He was carrying the same folder and a USB drive that had been couriered to him that morning from a forensic IT firm in Mapogu, and a single notarized statement from the MAS compliance officer in Singapore, and a copy of the coroner's note on Yu Sang-chul that Adaizi's classmate at the National Forensic Service had quietly photographed before it had been amended. He laid them on the table, one at a time. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He looked at the man at the head of the table, who was not Hwang Seo-yeon's father, but her father's elder brother, the man who had stood as godfather at Min Jae's own coming-of-age rite, the man who had taught him, at 17, how to bow correctly to the photograph of a friend's father in the year of mourning, the man the inner circle had called, since the early 80s, Hyung-nim. Min Jae said, Hyung-nim, the Labuan filings, the Vladivostok shell, the deaths of Park Ji-ho, Olu Adebayo, and Yu Sang-chul, the 41%. I have signed nothing this morning. I will sign nothing tonight. The man at the head of the table did not answer. He did not move. He looked at the folder and at the USB drive and at the coroner's note and at Min Jae, and he did not open his mouth. And the silence in that boardroom lasted the length of a breath that Min Jae had been taught, by his Halmeoni in Andong, was the length of a small prayer. That silence, the refusal of the man called Hyung-nim to deny what had been laid in front of him, was the 5th quotable line. The men around the table understood it before Min Jae had finished placing the last sheet. One of them, the chief financial officer, a man who had survived 3 administrations by knowing when to leave a room, stood up and walked out without speaking. The silence held. In the weeks that followed, the legal machinery turned off stage in the careful, bureaucratic register that the Korean prosecutorial service prefers, when the families involved have understood that the machinery cannot be stopped and that cooperation is the last available form of dignity. Court Order 2025-Hyung-Sang-1147 froze the Labuan account on the 2nd of December. Court Order 2025-Hyung-Sang-1153 froze the Vladivostok shell on the 4th. Indictments were issued on the 11th of December against 6 members of the Hwang family, including the elder brother who had been called Hyung-nim, and against 4 members of the Brotherhood Min Jae had inherited from his father, 2 of whom had been at the engagement banquet that had never been held. Hwang Seo-yeon was not indicted. She had, Adaizi said later, simply not known. She left for London on the 22nd of December and did not return. Min Jae did not attend the press conference. He did not attend the readings of the indictments. He went, on the morning of the 17th of December, to the grave in Yangpyeong, and he sat on the cold ground in front of the stone with the 2 names and the 1 date, and he sat there for 41 minutes, and he did not cry because he had been taught not to cry in front of his daughter, and the rule had outlived her. He began, the following week, the slow work of returning. He did not call a days. He had been told by his mother that calling would be a failure of imagination. Instead, he sent, on the first Monday, a wooden crate of Naju pears to the building in Itaewon, where Adaizi had taken a quiet apartment on a high floor. The pears had been wrapped, by his own hand, in the pale yellow paper his mother used. On the second Monday, he sent a stoneware jar of doenjang his mother had fermented in the autumn, with a handwritten note from his mother, and not from him, that said only, "Adaya, sigil teo meojora," eat while it is hot. On the third Monday, he sent a copy of a thin book of poems by Kim Hee-soon, and a copy of a thin book of essays by Han Kang, and a copy, in English, of a collection of poems by Lucille Clifton, which Adaizi's mother in Houston had read aloud to her in the year after Adaizi's father died. On the fourth Monday, he sent nothing, because his mother had told him that the fourth Monday belonged to silence. On the fifth Monday, he sent a single white envelope containing a court order he had filed that morning to release into a trust in the name of Kong Chiamaka. The entirety of the assets that had been frozen in the Labuan account, 4,300,000,000 won, to be administered in perpetuity by Adaize Onyeka for the funding of pediatric cardiac surgeries at Severance Hospital for children whose families could not pay. He did not include a note. The court order spoke. On the sixth Monday, Adaize called his mother, and his mother, who had not been told to expect the call, wept for the second time that year, the first having been in the doorway of the Beckrock room. On the seventh Monday, the first Monday in February, Adaize came to the Pyeongchang Dong house for dinner. She arrived at 6:14 p.m. She brought a small lacquered black box, smaller than the first, containing a single key on a red thread. She did not give the box to Min Jae. She gave it to his mother. She sat at the table where she had sat 11 years ago at her first dinner in that house. The empty chair had been holding open for her at the Shilla, and his mother ladled the doenjang jjigae into a stone bowl for her, and one for herself, and one, last, for him. The anchovy broth had been simmered for 41 minutes, no shorter. They did not speak for the first 8 minutes of the meal. When Adaize finally spoke, she set down her spoon and looked at Min Jae across the small kitchen table and said, "I will not be your wife again. I will not take your name. I will not sleep in any house you own. I will come to this kitchen on the second Sunday of every month for the rest of your mother's life, and I will come to her grave on every Chuseok and every Seolal until the day I cannot walk. The rest of you is not my work." That was the sixth quotable line. Min Jae bowed his head over his bowl and said, "Nay, yes." The story should have ended there, and in a lesser room it would have. But on the second Sunday in March, on the 11th anniversary of the night Chiamaka was born, an elder Min Jae had never met arrived at the Pyeongchang Dong house unannounced. She was a small woman in her late 70s, with skin the color of river stones at dusk, wearing a coat that had been tailored in Lagos in 1982, and that she had refused, over 4 decades, to replace. She was Adaize's mother's elder sister, Auntie Ngozi, who had raised Adaize for the 3 years between her father's death and her mother's recovery. She had flown in from Houston the previous night. She sat at the kitchen table and accepted a cup of barley tea and did not touch it for 19 minutes. Then she said, in English, the color of her village, addressing Min Jae directly for the first and only time. The prosecutor who signed the order on the 2nd of December, Yu Sang-chul's younger colleague, the one called Min Hua, was my sister's goddaughter. Her elder brother died in a case the brotherhood your father served lost in 2008 in a courtroom that was not honest. She has been waiting 18 years for an honest courtroom. She came to a days in Singapore in 2023 because she heard, through a friend at MAS, that a Nigerian Korean woman had been quietly tracking the Labuan filings of a family she had once belonged to. Adayez did not marry you, Min Jae, 11 years ago, because she fell in love at a bank in Gwanghwamun. She married you because the verdict in 2008 had not yet been answered, and your Halmioni in Andong had written a letter to my sister in 2009, asking her if she had a daughter who could be brave for a long time. My sister had 2 daughters. The braver one was Adayeze. The kitchen was very quiet. His mother did not look up from her tea. Adayeze did not look up from her bowl. Min Jae understood, in the way a man understands, that the floor he has been standing on was built by hands he never thanked, that he had been the smallest figure in a story that had been arranged, with patience and love and a long burning rage, by 3 old women across 2 continents and 1 ocean. Beginning in a year, he had been too young and too loud to notice. Auntie Ngozi reached into the inside pocket of her 1982 coat and removed a folded deed. She slid it across the kitchen table to Min Jae. It was the deed to a small house in the village of his Halmioni in Andong. The house his Halmioni had quietly purchased in 2009 in the name of a child not yet born, and had left, in her will, to be transferred to Kang Chiamaka on her 18th birthday. The 18th birthday would have been on the 17th of March of the following year. Auntie Ngozi asked him to sign the deed transferring the house, in Chiamaka's name, to the trust Adaisy now administered, to become a residency for the mothers of children awaiting cardiac surgery at Severance, who had traveled from the provinces and had nowhere to stay. Min Jae signed without reading past the 3rd page. The not reading was the gift. That was the 7th quotable line, the elder's request, and the silent bow he gave in answer, both at once. On the wall above the kitchen counter, in a plain wooden frame his Halmioni had hung there in 2014, was a photograph he had not looked at properly in 9 years. It had been taken at Severance Hospital on the 17th of March, 11 years ago, at 4:12 in the morning. In it, Adaisy, exhausted, was holding a newborn against her chest. His mother, who had ridden through the night from Pyeongchang-dong in the back of a taxi she had paid for herself, was leaning over them with both hands cradling the child's small head. Min Jae, standing slightly behind, was the only one not touching the baby. Below the photograph, in Hangul, in Igbo, and in Latin letters, the caption read, Kang Chiamaka, Kang Ye-rin, March 17, 2014. A son believes he has built an empire because he has signed his name on the right papers in the right rooms. A man wakes one morning 41 years into his life and understands that the empire was built around him, in kitchens he never entered, by women who never raised their voices, for a child whose name he did not deserve to keep saying. And the only honest work left to him is to learn to say it more quietly. If you have stayed with me all the way to this kitchen, all the way to this photograph, all the way to this signature on a deed that will outlive every man in this story, then sit with me for one more moment before you go. Ask yourself honestly what you would have done in the Beckrock room at 7:34 p.m. on the 17th of November. Ask yourself whose hair you have washed without telling anyone. Ask yourself whose mother you still pray for. And when you have your answer, leave it in the comments below, 1 sentence, no more, and subscribe to Midnight Love Saga, and tap the bell so that the next chapter, when it arrives, finds you the way Adayez finally let herself be found. Stay with us. There are more rooms. There are more mothers. There are more daughters who have not yet come home. And we will be here on the second Sunday of every month, with the doenjang simmering for 41 minutes, no shorter, waiting for you.